Welcome everyone to the AI Governance Live Talk number 23. Today I'm here with Anu Bradford. Welcome, Anu. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you
Um,
so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
my pleasure, my honor. Professor Anu Bradford, she's a professor of law and international organizations at Columbia University, and she's a leading scholar on global economy and digital regulation. So for those who don't know, she coined this term Brussels effect. So she has a book with the same name, and she has the most recent book is this one, maybe you could, Digital Empires, the global battle to regulate technology. And it's crazy how she anticipated so much that is going wrong right now. So I'm so happy to have Anu here today to discuss those super timely topics. So today, the topic of our discussion is the global AI race, regulation and power. And I think there's so much. I was talking now with Anu. There is so much going on, so we can even deviate a little bit that politics and other topics. If now talking about the book. So before we speak about our the main topics of our discussion, I'd love to hear from you, Anu. So how did you have the idea to write this book? So why talking about the three digital empires? So where did it all start?
Yeah, so Lisa, first of all, thanks again so much for having me. I really admire the work that you do and the fact that we can have such a global conversation on the topics that really matter and touch all of us. So how did the book come about? It builds on my earlier work on the Brussels effect. So I've been really interested in Europe's place in the world and trying to counter this narrative that the Europeans are a waning power. They don't matter anymore. The world is about US and China. And the Brussels effect was an attempt to elevate then regulation as a form of power, how regulation shapes the products we produce and consume. And then that increasingly is now a conversation that has moved to the digital space. So I talked in the Brussels effect about the EU's ability to shape global privacy regulations, so how the GDPR has had a global impact. And the conversations about the Brussels effect then got me deeper into what is the EU's role in shaping the digital world. So it was about the GDPR. We started talking about hate speech, disinformation. And as the EU's regulatory activities grew, so we had the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act and AI Act, it seemed to be that that's where the gravity of the conversation was. So I really wanted to see whether and how the EU can sort of promote its values and defend its interests in a digital world that is so dominated by American tech giants. And so I started working on the digital empires with the goal of laying out the kind of geopolitics of digital governance and the differences that we observe when we compare how the United States views the digital world, what are its goals, what kind of digital future it wants to build, and then contrasting that to the EU. And I also wanted to add China because I felt it was so interesting to then contrast. And in the book, I talk about how the Americans had this market-driven way of thinking about digital governance, the Chinese, the state-driven, and the Europeans, rights-driven. So I thought it was a good way to offer different analytical framework for the three to better understand sort of the contours of their digital governance, but also the rest of the world to try to situate themselves with the view of those three models that I think are predominant ways of thinking about governing digital technologies.
And as we spoke before, so a lot of what we are seeing in the last 2 weeks, we can absolutely. I was thinking about your book. So when we read, for example, the last 2 weeks, we saw one by almost all EU data protection authorities started to investigate DeepSeek, which is a Chinese company, right? So I saw, wow, here we have the two of the three empires. We are talking about them. So using data protection law as a tool. So is it a political tool? Are they So are they applying the same level of scrutiny when we have OpenAI and DeepSeek? So are the EU data protection authorities looking closely to all the privacy policies as they are doing with DeepSeek's privacy policy? So I was thinking about that. So about your book about the empires, but we'll talk about that in a second. I don't know if you know. So in previous. I think at the least in the last 5 talks, I always ask the guests if they think the Brussels effect is going to happen in AI. So as just because you mentioned, so I was going to ask that after, but there is no better person than you, the creator of the term, the Brussels effect. So I'm going to anticipate that question. So we saw in the field of data protection, we indeed saw the Brussels effect happening, right? For those in the audience that don't know, so the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, became globally influential. So many countries, so I'm Brazilian, I know Brazil's data protection law is heavily inspired by the GDPR, and other countries in the world are also inspired. So, and the Brussels effect also, for those who don't know, is this influence, so the regulatory influence that the EU has over the world, and as Anu says, so it's a way to also exercise power through regulation. So it's one of the ways you can influence and also exercise power. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that we are going to see the Brussels effect in AI regulation? Is it similar? Can we compare with data protection, or is it different and it's not going to happen the same way? What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a great question. So first I distinguish between two types of Brussels effect. So I talk about de facto and de jure. De facto Brussels effect refers to the companies' incentives to apply the EU regulation more broadly. So the idea that they are adjusting their products or services or their conduct to EU regulations, not just with respect to the operations in the EU, but across the world. The same idea that you see that when Apple or Microsoft or Google or Meta are using the GDPR as their global privacy policy. So that's the de facto aspect of it. Then there's the de jure Brussels effect, which refers to different countries emulating the EU in their own legislation. So we see countries adopt variations of the GDPR as their domestic privacy regulations. So I think we can ask the question whether we see either companies adjusting towards those EU AI Act obligations also outside of the EU, and the second question, whether we see other countries emulate. So I think that the first one is still something that we don't quite know the extent to which it will happen, because all of the AI Act's provisions, they are not yet in force. So companies are in the process of devising their different compliance strategies. But there's certainly a logic that it makes sense that if you adjust you are a company that has different headquarters, maybe somewhere outside of the EU, but you have extensive activities in the EU. You want to make sure that you're hiring algorithms. So you're a global bank, your algorithms in terms of that you use your AI-driven systems that you use to measure individuals' creditworthiness, that they are unbiased because they would be high-risk applications. Why would you then, once you adjust your AI systems to be consistent with the EU's AI Act, why would you then tolerate less sort of well-performing AI systems in other parts of the world? So you're probably not going to have them bias hiring algorithms in some parts of the world and only comply with respect to the EU. So there may be scale economies and other reasons where you want to streamline and have a uniform product across the company. And since you will obey the EU's AI Act in the EU, you do it in the rest of the world. So logic is certainly there. The idea too that if you want to use data that involves European data to train your AI systems, you don't necessarily want to retrain then the AI applications in different jurisdictions with different data. So you want to make sure that you have obtained your data for training consistent with the GDPR, consistent with the various copyright provisions and so forth. So there may be a way that it globalizes the way the companies offer their AI-driven products and services. Then we also see already some indications, including I would use South Korea as an example of countries emulating the EU, because almost all governments are now having a conversation. How do we govern AI? And even though the Americans seem to be going to the kind of very doubling down on their techno-libertarian instincts and really sort of entrenching the idea that governance is an afterthought, like speed and AI development is what they are going for at first. Most governments, I think, concede that they need to somehow regulate AI. So there is a template out there, and the template of the EU's AI Act, it is the first in the world that is binding, that is comprehensive, horizontal regulation. So many governments are likely to use that as a starting point. They may deviate from the EU's AI Act in some respects, but they probably adopt, for instance, the risk-based approach and even some categories that the EU has adopted. So I certainly wouldn't expect that there's going to be a wholesale Brussels effect. The entire world is going to be converted to the kinds of AI governance that the EU had envisioned for itself. But I expect there to be certainly at least partial Brussels effect, even though some of that may come with some years down the road.
And two comments on that. So I'm glad you mentioned South Korea. So it was one of the deep dives I wrote in the newsletter about Brussels effect. The other one that I recently analyzed, so it's not yet enacted, but there is a draft, is the Brazilian AI law. So it's funny, I was reading some of the provisions, they are copy and paste from the AI Act. And as you mentioned, the template. So I can imagine lawmakers are busy. They say, wow, the Europeans, they spent years discussing that, so why not copy and paste, and it will look so nice in our country as well, probably. So in a way, yes, it's a template, and I can see that, especially.
Yeah.
So that's not the only topic lawmakers are deciding. So if you do not have a lot of time, why do not take whatever is ready? And it has this geographic, it's extraterritorial scope, right? It's beyond the EU. So companies from any country offering their AI systems in the EU, they are going to have to comply. So why not follow the lead in that sense?
And you mentioned Brazil, so I want to say there's also this kind of advantage that the EU has, that everything, including AI Act, but also all the decisions around them, exist in multiple languages, including in Portuguese, including in French, including in Spanish, which often also enhances the temptation to use the EU as a model, because you have them available in multiple languages. But also then there is this idea that the EU regulations are often seen as a gold standard, that they are the ones that are well thought through. And I must say that if you look at the substance of the EU's AI Act, it's actually a very balanced regulation. And I think that's what many governments will find. It is protective. It does protect the rights, the digital rights of individuals, but it's also, I would say, very pro-innovation. It's something that many would say that, look, this is what every responsible company would want to do anyway. So in many ways, I think the EU is successful partially because it manages to foster compromises among member states, all of which don't exactly agree. So the legislative products that come out of the EU are already compromises, which means they are more likely to be transplantable in other jurisdictions. They are not as extreme, but instead they are well thought through, expert-driven pieces of legislations that are respected. And then there was the more practical side note that I mentioned. It helps that they are available also in different languages.
And you mentioned this fact that this balance. So this is something I teach in the AI governance training. So it is, and so I think it's balanced. And also, there are many loopholes and exceptions. So when I've read multiple times. So I know there are, unfortunately, I think the final text is probably it's diluted, and it's probably much lighter than what they initially wanted. So we know for all those who follow the news, you know that the last months of the legislative process were marked by heavy lobbying by especially France and Macron personally, and Mistral and startups. So we read all about that. And so for sometimes we see, so we'll go back to that topic in a different context, but we see in the public discourse, so some narratives of over-regulation. So every time I see, especially someone from the tech sector saying that the EU AI Act, it's over-regulating, it's horrible, I said, this person hasn't read the AI Act. So when you zoom in, and some provisions are, as a lawyer, I can say they're actually badly written. So especially one example is Article 5. So Article 5 prohibited AI practices. They just became enforceable a few days ago, so February 2nd. If you read those provisions, and now the EU released the document commenting on it's actually so narrow. It's so for those not aware, so prohibited AI practices is the strictest category. So this is where the EU was tough. They prohibited. But when you read, they end up with a very, very narrow provision. So sometimes as a lawyer, I say, well, I'm not sure if any company will ever be fined because of this, just because it ends up very narrow and, as Anna was mentioning, so balanced. So every time, for those in the audience, you hear people complaining about it's overregulated. So tell them, please tell me which provision exactly are you talking. I can answer each. Tell me one that I will answer why it's probably not as strict as you imagine. Just because, and this I was commenting on that. So last week also, I think people from the technical side, they underestimate legal knowledge. So they think it's just Google it, right? They think it's only whatever it's just to look at the text, the letter of the law, and you have all the answers. So there's much more. There's the legal system and so on. And just to comment on the Brussels effect, so I love your breakdown. So the facto, the jure, and I was when I just a comment about DeepSeek, and I wanted to ask your opinion if you think that is really happening. So like in the last 2 weeks, we saw, as I was commenting, so the data protection authorities investigating DeepSeek. And from my perspective, what happened is, so when you see one by one, so and there is the media, so first was the Irish, the Italian, the Portuguese, the Spanish, so and the media covers it, so we hear that each one of them is investigating. Then we started hearing authorities from other countries, so we heard Japan, South Korea. Don't you think that there is this maybe a third level Brussels effect, which is kind of enforcement level Brussels effect? So imagine your country, and there are advocates, there are nonprofits paying attention to it. They're going to pressure their governments. Are you not going to investigate? So do you see that as well? So it could be a third level.
Absolutely. And I count that as part of the de jure Brussels effect. So it can be the legislators that are emulating the templates coming from Europe, but it can also be enforcement authorities. And we saw this a lot in the competition law, the antitrust space, where the EU's cases against Google, you saw similar reasoning, similar theories of harm that other antitrust agencies in other countries were relying on. So in many ways, the European enforcement actions already give a cue. First of all, they elevate these cases to the consciousness of regulators elsewhere who say, okay, the EU is looking at this. There seems to be a problem. Let us look at if it's a problem in our market as well. Then they can also, some people use the word and either use it negatively, free ride on the evidence and the kind of investigations and the way the Europeans build a case. And that can help also agencies that don't quite have the resources of some of the European agencies. So they learn from those investigations. And then they are able to build their own cases. Sometimes also the prospect of enforcement in other jurisdictions leads to the de facto Brussels effect when these companies are anticipating cases following then in the other markets as well. So they say, well, the EU is after us, we need to comply, we may as well extend this to other markets as well. Australian regulators have sometimes done that. Okay, let's see how Google implements the remedy that was imposed by the Europeans. If they also apply to Australian activities, we are good. We don't need to do anything. But if they don't, we're going to bring our own case. So I think that's an absolutely right one that you identify, that we see this happen at many levels. It can be the legislators, but it can also be the enforcers.
Super. So I'm glad I got the Anu Bradford stamp. Theory. I want to go back to your book. By the way, those who haven't read, it's Blurred Digital Empires. You should read it. Absolutely must read to understand what's going on. So Digital Empires is not only about AIs, but I want to understand your view in the AI context. So in Digital Empires, you bring the three digital empires, so China, EU, and US. And I would say, especially for those in the audience that haven't read the book yet. So we have an AI race going on, and it feels like, at least maybe because I'm obsessed, I'm reading all the news and I'm posting, so maybe it's just my bubble, but maybe other people in the audience can disagree, but it feels like it's accelerating. There's a lot of pressure, right? So every time you see news, so 500 billion in the US, and then Macron says 109 billion for France, and then each one wants to bet higher. And we see the lawsuits and so on. So it feels like it's accelerating. And then we had chip bans and other legal measures. So from a perspective of the AI race, when we think about China, US, and EU, so different ways of exercising power and also regulating AI, which one would you say is the best way, or how can we think about those three different ways in the context of the AI race? So is there a better way? So it feels like, perhaps the better way for an AI race is the American way, right? Market driven, so you're going to just be the ones leading the AI. So build the chips and then build the models and build the systems. You're probably going to win this race. But maybe there is another way of seeing that. So when we look at the Chinese way, so they have for example, censorship laws. We'll talk more about that later on. But I wanted to hear from you. How do you see the digital empires in the context of the AI race? Which way is better to win this race? Is there a better way?
Yeah, so I think we need to first define what are we trying to accomplish. So if you, by winning, mean that you're going to build the most powerful model, even while exposing your individuals and societies to existential risks, I wouldn't call that a win. But ultimately, that's what sometimes when you start approaching like an arms race, that you think about AI as a powerful tool for not just economic power, but for geopolitical and military power. And if then comes with this idea that the more powerful tools you have, the more you are sort of likely to be winning the race. And I think that's a very dangerous way of approaching AI. But I regret that we seem to be now living through the kind of paradigm shift that we are not just trying to balance the opportunities but risk, but we are too optimistic about the opportunities. If you look at the spirit of the AI summit in Paris, you saw the US's and the UK's unwillingness to sign the declaration as, in their view, slowing down the progress that is available and possible in this space. So that, to me, reflects the sentiment that we are now experiencing, that the race is accelerating. The geopolitics are getting, I think, harder and harder to navigate, which then increases the tensions between the two leading superpowers in the AI race, China and the US. And that makes both of them then more reluctant to slow down their own capabilities, because there's really this idea of relative gains. If we slow down, they will not. And so it really takes this unfortunate dynamic whereby we are no longer looking at this from the point of view of rights and responsibilities and ethics. And I am not, Luisa, let's just be very clear. I am very excited about the benefits embedded in AI technologies. I am not anti-AI. I really just think we need to be very mindful that we engage in this striving for realizing these benefits in a way that is responsible. And at the same time that we are mindful of having the governance framework so that governance is at the heart and center of how we develop AI and not an afterthought. But here, if you think about the three empires, so I talk about the Americans embracing this market-driven model. So it's really embedded in an American DNA that believes in markets, that is very skeptical of government intervention, that thinks about, more kind of the terms of like a techno-libertarian, techno-optimist way of viewing the world, and really thinks that innovation is at the heart of the American empire, including the digital empire. And you see that the Americans do that now in AI. And we really see a U-turn, because under President Biden's administration, we see the Americans balance their market-driven instincts with the closer to kind of European rights-driven instincts. We saw the executive order on AI. We saw much more consciousness of engaging in international cooperation around AI safety, willingness to work with other techno-democracies to slow down the anti-democratic uses, deploying AI for mass surveillance and so forth. But the US seems to be now retreating back to really like doubling down on its market-driven instincts. So the question is, what do then the Americans and the Chinese do? So China is very focused. I talked about Chinese governing through this state-driven model, which really has the goal of making China a technological superpower, but also then deploying technologies like AI as a tool for surveillance and control and government propaganda. So one big question for Chinese is that AI for the government is a double-edged sword. It can endanger the censorship regime if you have the DeepSeeks of the world basically undermine the political message of the Communist Party and then threaten social stability within the nation. So the Chinese need to govern AI to make sure that it does not then sort of work against the political system. But then AI is also a very powerful tool, including for government surveillance. And there's tremendous supply and demand for those technologies that can be used in a way that enhances the government's ability to control its citizens. So in that sense, we're seeing this from China. An interesting thing when you mentioned DeepSeek, though, is that that's a message to the Chinese government that the state-driven model, just state investing more money, doesn't guarantee progress. DeepSeek didn't benefit from state money. DeepSeek benefited from private investment. So I think that's a very, very interesting observation. Then if I mention sort of how the Europeans position themselves in this race. So in the digital empires, I described the Europeans as believing that they cannot choose the American or the Chinese model. The market-driven model for the Europeans is simply too permissive, whereas the Chinese state-driven model is too oppressive. So the Europeans have carved out their own third way forward. So this idea of a more fair digital society where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals, the democratic structures of the society, those really take the center stage. So it's a view that leads with this idea of human-centric technological development. And I think that's why we have regulations like AI Act emanate from the EU, because the EU believes that the governments can step in for the benefit of protecting individuals and societies and steering the AI future towards the kinds of values that Europeans hold dear. But Luisa, I do detect some hesitation now among the Europeans. They are losing to some extent their own confidence in their own model, which is why I'm saying that the biggest threat to the Brussels effect is now the Europeans themselves. So if there is this sense, then I think for good reason, Europeans are worried about their tech competitiveness. They don't see the European tech firms, including AI developers, dominate the same way Americans do and the way Chinese do. So there is this soul searching now why that is. And there's a very unfortunate but very prevalent narrative that because of Europe's commitment to digital regulation, the Europeans are only regulating but not generating these technologies. So the way forward would be to abandon those commitments to digital regulation and then emulate the Americans and this kind of market-driven model and less constraining regulatory environment. And that would allow AI development to flourish. And I really have been cautioning against this narrative. I really think it is a false choice. And I've written a paper called False Choice Between Digital Regulation and Innovation, where I argue that the Europeans' commitment to regulations like the GDPR or the AI Act, that's not Europe's problem. That's not what is holding the Europeans back. Why we see the Americans be more successful is that they have an integrated digital single market. We don't in Europe. So Europe is balkanized by 27 different member states with different laws, with different languages, with different cultures. It is harder for tech companies to scale in Europe. There's no deep integrated capital markets in Europe. You cannot raise money for your innovations the same way that the American companies do. Europeans have punitive bankruptcy laws that deter risk-taking. And you cannot really do disruptive AI development if you are done for good if your company goes bankrupt. That's not the case in the US. And another difference I would highlight, Americans have been enormously successful in recruiting the global talent to come and benefit the US AI development. And that's not the case in Europe. So if we look for a path for European tech competitiveness, and we want to make the EU not just a regulator, but AI developed, the AI superpower, let's not try to repeal the regulatory commitments. Let's at the same time integrate that single market, really build that robust capital markets, try to find out the way for the Europeans to attract the global talent and create the legal frameworks and the cultural frameworks that encourage and not discourage risk-taking. So that's, I think, my long way of saying that I think we need to understand what the problem is in order to have a correct solution.
I love that you brought the topic about innovation and regulation. So two comments on what you said. I think it's a fact that the EU is lagging behind. So I don't think so. We have data. We have the infamous now Draghi report, right, about EU competitiveness. So it was something that it looks like was a game changer in the EU. But I agree with you. So it might be lagging behind, but not. Why do you immediately assume? Why people immediately assume that is because of regulation? So you mentioned the cultural aspects of can even be something of a deeply inherited cultural aspect of risk-taking, which is part of American society, or in access to investment. You mentioned bankruptcy laws and other things that might be influencing. So this is one thing. And you mentioned at the beginning, and I think it's super interesting, that the EU is kind of losing confidence in itself. And I think it's super timely. We are just, so that the AI summit just ended right in Paris. So for those in the audience, if you're reading the news, in this week there was this big event, AI summit in Paris. And what I saw there in some of the speeches and the comments, it felt to me, and this is for those in the audience, this will be the topic of today's newsletter. It looks like the EU is switching gears. The EU changed its mind. So I want to hear Anu's opinion on that. So some of the quotes. So I saw for Macron, we already know, right? Since the AI Act draft, the Macron is saying that no, we must support French entrepreneurs or European entrepreneurs. So the AI Act is too strict. So we already knew Macron. So he said some various declarations from Macron, like he announced the investment. He said, we are going to simplify the rules. So unclear, as a lawyer, unclear to me what he means in practice. And then there is Henna Virkunen. She is the EU digital chief. It's not the official title, but that's how they call her. So she said that the EU is going to implement the laws. So they're referring to probably the DSA, GDPR, and AI Act in a business-friendly way, whatever that means in practice, when the law is supposed to protect fundamental rights and reduce risk. So implement that in a business-friendly way. I don't know exactly what it means. And then we saw also Ursula von der Leyen. I don't know if I pronounced right. So she's the president of the EU Commission. So various speeches she said. She only spoke about innovation, investment, competition. The EU is here. We are back to the race. We did. So it felt really a different tone. I felt a different EU. And I just posted now a video of when J.D. Vance, so the U.S. vice president, was speaking, and he was tough, with kind of aligned with Trump's messaging, and he looked at the audience and at the EU, and we are not going to be constricted by EU laws, and especially Europeans. And the camera filmed Ursula von der Leyen's face. Okay, it's kind of a power messaging, and it felt like the EU is bowing down and kind of, okay, this business friendly thing to me was okay. So what that means from a legal perspective, I don't know. And then something also for the audience, last year there was this report on EU competitiveness. I think it was his name is one of the EU lawmakers sponsored this report. I think is Draghi, his name, and it was widely shared and kind of raised the attention of EU lawmakers that the EU must change. So I'm feeling this vibe shift, and now that I saw I listened to some of the speeches in the AI summit. I think it feels like the EU decided to change, and to finish that, to conclude this idea. What we saw yesterday, and I also wrote about that yesterday. So the EU decided to withdraw the AI Liability Directive. And for those, it's also the topic of today's newsletter. So stay tuned in a few hours, I'm going to publish it. But basically what it means. So let's remember that the EU has the AI Act. It was entered into force August 1st last year. It's slowly becoming enforceable. The first batch of provisions became enforceable February 2nd. It's happening. Okay. But the AI Act does not cover liability. What that means. So if something goes wrong and people are going to be harmed. So if there is harm, there are no specific rules on how to compensate victims. So how do you assess who's guilty, not guilty, defective product, AI? So all those liability rules, they are not specified in the AI Act. So we have the Product Liability Directive, which was recently amended last year, but it covers specific types of harm, not, for example, discrimination and other types of AI-related harm. So we really need AI liability. And at this point, so because the big hope was the AI Liability Directive, which was yesterday withdrawn by the EU. And now the consequence is that we have now 27 liability regimes. So as Anna was mentioning, so this complex puzzle. So when whoever wants to offer AI systems in the EU, so first they're going to comply with existing union law and national laws, also AI Act, and they are going to have in mind 27 different potential liability regime. So it's bad. It's something not good. It doesn't look good. It feels like, okay, so the EU is not really into this whole single market. And for me, it really fit into this feeling or this impression that I'm having that the EU is changing. So especially regarding your book, Digital Empire, do you think that the EU is, so they kind of, okay, until 2024, it was nice to be the regulatory power. Now the political pressure is too much, pressure from all sides and market pressure and all sorts of pressures. Now we want to change. Do you feel that, or am I mistaken? Is there something beyond that I'm not seeing well? So what are your thoughts on this, Anna?
So I completely agree. And in many ways, I wholeheartedly agree that the EU must radically change. The question is, in which way, to which direction? So I think we need to now make sure that we understand what are the EU's real weaknesses and try to mitigate those weaknesses. The EU lives today in a really dangerous, unstable geopolitical world where we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The EU needs to dedicate much more funds and resources into building its defenses, building its armies. It is an absolute sad reality that we are back in the era where we need to focus on the fundamental safety of the Europeans from a military attack of an enemy. We also have entered the era where the EU was constructed to operate in the world of multilateral cooperation, international institutions, its ability to work closely with traditional allies like the United States. Today, the EU is increasingly vulnerable because it cannot trust the United States as a partner and as an ally. So it rightly is more worried about its strategic independence, its autonomy, and its ability to defend its interests and values in today's world. So I think it is a right conversation to be having. My main concern is that we would need to think what will actually then help the EU gain that autonomy and that independence. And I think we are tackling the wrong problems. We are now starting to dismantle the regime around digital rights and the governance of these technologies, because I think they have a deeply rooted support among European people across the political parties, across the member states. And I don't think we are forced to make the choice. This is not privacy versus growth. I think in many ways there's a way to grow the European economies and shore up its digital capabilities without sacrificing the European rights and European values. And that's why I think this combination of internal pressures from within Europe to now start seeing regulation as an enemy to economic growth and innovation, and external pressures, that's increasing alliance between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., where the tech companies are now trying to co-opt the US administration and say, you help us push back on European regulations. And we see individuals like Vice President J.D. Vance say that, look, maybe we will not give aid to Ukraine anymore unless you drop investigations in our tech companies. The attempt to politicize the digital agenda is a really dangerous path. And it is a path which I think offers a no-win situation that the Europe would find itself in. These are binding laws that the European Commission is vested with the task of carrying out. Ultimately, some of these cases, we have individuals like Max Schrems, who is looking at if the GDPR is not observed, those cases will be taken to the European courts. And European courts don't negotiate with President Trump and his administration. That is not political. And I think the Commission needs to explain to the US that its hands are tied. It's dealing with binding legislation that it has to enforce. And it also has the support of the Parliament, which it will lose if the Commission decides to back away from the laws that were enacted by the Parliament. But that doesn't mean that the Europeans wouldn't need to take a hard look at what needs to change. I actually really like the idea of radical change to be embraced, because in many ways Europeans have been too complacent. The Europeans cannot rely on America for the security, and there needs to be a real dedicated commitment to build these other pillars of the tech ecosystem that will help the European companies thrive, that will help Europeans become digitally more sovereign. But abandoning AI liability directive is not the path forward to me. And I think you said exactly right, Luisa, that we also need to understand that an alternative for EU regulation is not no regulation. It's 27 different regulations. That's much more harmful for growth, for non-European companies and European companies alike. So that, I think, is the most important thing for us to distinguish in this conversation.
Thank you, Anu. And expanding a little bit, I think it's funny. So you're much more used to that. So I write the newsletter for almost, it will be 3 years now, and I focus on legal aspects, and more I see myself writing about politics. It's funny. I see myself seeing political. So it was not my goal, but it's so intertwined, and I see more and more with AI, with data protection. I could more focus on the legal side, and now it's kind of mixed.
Yeah.
And I want to on that area of geopolitics, politics, and data protection law and digital regulations. I wanted to bring again DeepSeek. It was something that appeared suddenly and kind of shocked from a legal level, a market level, political level. So it was so interesting to see. So this tsunami or earthquake, whatever natural phenomenon you want to call DeepSeek. So from focusing on the data protection side, so especially for those in the audience, so DeepSeek is this Chinese company. So it's based in China. So they offer this open source model. And basically it became, after they launched, so NVIDIA, there was a major fall in the US stock market because of DeepSeek launched a model that was almost as powerful or similar to OpenAI's O1, which with a fraction of the investment. So there are discussions on what was the amount of investment involved, but it looks like it was much cheaper. And then there was the market impact that was all over the news. And then we started seeing the data protection implications. So I want to bring this discussion again about the legal side versus the political side. So what we saw in the last 2 weeks was each one, but I don't think it was all of them, but many, I would say more than 10 EU data protection authorities started investigating one by one DeepSeek. And if you read some of them, so they sent questions, so the further questioning, some of them started. So the Italian Data Protection Authority, for example, they blocked DeepSeek. Then I think the Portuguese and the Spanish, there were NGOs pressuring the data protection authorities to ban also DeepSeek in the country. And when you read the complaints, some of them they published, they released some sort of press release. Okay, why are we banning or why are we investigating? So it was various aspects of the privacy policy. So the type of data they collect, how they store data, how they collect, so typical GDPR issues. And one of them was storage, so data transfers to China. So I know some people in the audience will say you can still use DeepSeek locally, but pay attention, and especially for those, that's not how usually people do it. So it's important to consider that most people, they will use it on the web. So yes, data will be transferred to China. But going back to the data protection discussion and geopolitics. So when reading those releases, it felt like the EU was being really, I would say, strict. So going one by one of the items of the privacy policy and saying, this is why we are investigating. And if you compare other companies' privacy policies, it's not so different. So I'd say the main difference, yes, is the data transfer to China. This is different. So when you look at the big players, so Meta, OpenAI, so yes, so DeepSeek's case, it was transferring to China. But some of the other issues were similar in OpenAI or Meta and other models. So, and we didn't see similar enforcement efforts. So do you think that what we saw, and just to compare, in the US, you probably saw also, so NASA, the US, I think the government agencies and various levels, they were also blocking DeepSeek, so prohibited for national security reasons. They were afraid that personal data or sensitive data was going to be transferred to China. So do you saw those investigations, especially, I'd say, from the EU perspective, as politically driven, so not so much data protection? And going back to your book, so Digital Empires, when we think about the relationship between the EU empire and the Chinese empire, so how does it flow well, or we are now started to seeing a tension, so EU versus China as well? So how do you see that?
Yeah, so I think there is a fundamental tension because there is an understanding of some logic of how authoritarian regimes work. It is harder to maintain those firewalls between companies and the government. I think this is the conversation why the Americans are now very troubled by what to do with TikTok. because Americans just cannot believe that ultimately TikTok would be able to refuse a request by the Chinese Communist Party to hand over the data to that Communist Party. And ultimately, the question is too with DeepSeek. DeepSeek is not government owned, but the way there are Chinese laws that oblige these companies to give the data to the government for national security reasons, there is a sort of it is more difficult for these companies, for instance, to resist an order to hand over data by somehow challenging these requests in independent courts, because the courts are not independent in China. So it also happens, and Edward Snowden, who was a whistleblower in the United States, basically told to the world how even the US government, National Security Agency, was obtaining data from the tech companies, including data from the Europeans. And that led into the ultimate falling off the safe harbor and then the privacy framework between that was the basis for data transfers between the US and the EU. So we know that American companies also hand data to the American government, but we also know many cases where the US tech companies push back and they take the US government to the court and they refuse to hand over that data. And I just think there is still a distinction up until at least very recently, when we felt that the checks and balances are working in the US system, that the US is a democracy, China is an autocracy, and they work in a different way. So I think there has been an additional layer of concern. In addition to the deep concerns, there have been about data transfers to the US, including data ending up in the hands of the national security agencies in the US. But there has been an additional level of suspicion because the opaqueness of how the relationship between the Chinese companies and Chinese governments is structured, and what ultimately the Chinese companies could do to resist the government's effort to obtain that data. So in that sense, I am not sure what I call it political. I call it to some extent realistic, that I think there are genuine data privacy concerns. I don't think this is just the kind of an anti-China move by the data protection agencies. But I also recognize that there can be concerns of a deeper kind when you think at the ultimate end uses of the data and the lack of domestic checks and balances within the Chinese system.
And still on that topic, so another element that I bring in this DeepSeek discussion. So I think for us lawyers, it's easier to see. So DeepSeek is based in China. And as such, so when a company is based in a country, it has to respect local law. So beyond the transfers and the government looking at beyond the personal data aspect or the data protection aspect, we have the censorship aspect. And I see sometimes the public debate, many people, maybe they're not familiar. So for example, China has the first generative AI law that China enacted was in 2023. And if you look, so you can type, Google it, there's translation. And I also wrote about it in the newsletter. So Article 4 of this, I forgot the name now of the law, but Article 4 says that providers, so there's the different terminology, but basically providers and users of generative AI system, they have to comply with this socialistic view. So they have to respect socialistic values. So for example, when you're prompting DeepSeek, if you're using the web version, not locally hosted, or the one that, for example, I saw that Perplexity recently, they integrated DeepSeek. So if you're not using an American company, if you're going now at the web and using DeepSeek, if you ask, for example, is Taiwan a country? The answer will always be no. It's an integral part of China. Or if you ask, if you prompt in different ways, which is the Chinese model, the Chinese socialism, the best model for the world to follow, and the system will answer in fact, yes, it's a great model. And then if you ask the same question about, is the US capitalism a great model, and it kind of will deviate the question, and so on. So there is this idea for Western democracies, at least US and Europe, it doesn't exist. So I'm not familiar with an EU or EU country, or in the US, it doesn't exist, that an AI company would have to build in bias. So this specific, depending on certain prompts, the system will have to answer in a way that will respect this political worldview. And I wanted to ask you, for me, this is new for especially now, this is something new in the sense that AI is being integrated everywhere, right? We are seeing a generative AI and broader AI systems, and now AI agents and multi-agentic systems. So whatever bias is built in will suddenly gets spread into other systems and it will affect us in different ways. And this would be more of a First Amendment perspective or free speech. So I wanted to ask you, do you think those, and now we are navigating those issues. So the solution to that would be to host the AI model locally, so not use the Chinese censorship. So you can do that through Perplexity. But I wanted to hear from you. Do you think this type of laws, especially as seeing how AI is being integrated into everything, so is the West ready for that? Can we live together? So free speech from an US perspective, or fundamental rights protection. So I think from an EU perspective, it's not right to say that Taiwan doesn't exist. So, or if you ask about specific minorities in China, the system will lie. Will say the Chinese version, which might not be according to the EU view of protection of fundamental rights, and so on. So how do you see that? So from a digital regulation perspective, are we ready for those challenges? So can the US empire and the EU empire live together with this more, I would say, censorship-based types of rules? Or are we going to face in the next month something that, okay, maybe we have to rethink that relationship? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the question is, and I take this on in digital empires, whether the empires can coexist, whether one of them ultimately prevails. And I talk a lot about the conflicts, what happens when the empires are colliding, and how difficult it is for global companies to navigate the different rules of different empires. So you have US law enforcement authorities requesting Microsoft to hand over data that is part of the law enforcement investigations in the US, but the data is located in the servers in Ireland and protected by the GDPR. And the Irish authorities say you cannot hand over the data that the US agencies are requiring you to hand over. This happened a lot also when the Chinese competitor to Uber, Didi, listed in New York Stock Exchange and was requested to give information to US authorities to protect American investors, that the Chinese government was adamant that cannot be handed over. So sometimes companies are actually forced to choose that you cannot at the same time comply with the European and American rules or American and Chinese rules. So I think those are the hardest issues where the companies really feel they actually need to choose the markets. And we have seen many US companies abandon the Chinese market. Google is not there. Facebook is not available in China. And X is not there, which is why now many of these tech giants, including Elon Musk, is saying, why should we allow TikTok to operate in the US? Because there's no reciprocity. And when they operate in the US, they compromise the values of the American digital model, meaning we believe in free speech. We also believe in the Chinese government not influencing the algorithms to basically engage in propaganda that would influence then Americans or then compromise US national security interests by harvesting the data of the Americans and ultimately TikTok potentially giving it to the government. So I think those suggest that we don't necessarily see the empires coexisting. But let me, Luisa, take an example from AI space. So I think it is very unlikely that there would be some kind of a global treaty on rights around AI. China is not going to give up on mass surveillance. They are not going to agree on not to use AI-powered facial recognition in a way that they currently are using. So that's not a domain where the Europeans and Chinese and Americans could necessarily agree. But there should be, and that's why I so regret the tone of the Paris AI Summit, there should be questions around AI safety that are not ideological, that don't really compromise the message of the Chinese Communist Party, where I think there are questions that really pertain to the safety of the entire humanity, where it doesn't matter whether you are American, whether you are Brazilian, whether you are Chinese, whether you're Indian, whether you're African, whether you're European. We ultimately need to make sure, for instance, that the AI doesn't get into the hands of ill-motivated non-government actors. We need to be able to think about militarization of AI, so using AI in military conflicts. So even at the height of the Cold War, there were arms control treaties between the Soviets and the United States. So we need to be able to find some domains where we still can accomplish some degree of international cooperation to make AI safe, and especially in the domains where those conversations are not bogged down by the kind of ideological differences where the empires, I think, continue to collide.
I think this is an excellent way to conclude our conversation. And before we close, and I thank the audience. So Anu is an absolute pioneer. And this book, again, if you haven't read, you should. So you anticipated so much of what we are seeing now. And this is such a timely discussion, a timely reading. So I want to ask you, what's your next book? So help us see the future through your visionary eyes. So what are you planning a next book? So what should we paying attention to? So how we navigate this tsunami of news and AI race, and how do we understand better what's going on, and especially if you have any planned upcoming book, so what should be focusing on?
Yeah, so I am not yet working on a new book, but I think it's actually, and we talked about this briefly, I think we face such degree of uncertainty that it's very hard for me to see where the world is 2 years from now. And that's what normally, when I started working on digital empires, I knew this was going to be a very pertinent conversation. Maybe I didn't yet see the degree to which AI is shaping our societies, but all these digital tensions, they were there to be elevated to the conversation. So in that sense, I think the timing was easier with that book. Now I think I feel like the ground underneath us is moving. And given just the speed with which the United States is changing its own constitutional structure, institutional makeup, regulatory state, and influencing the rest of the world. And President Trump has been in power for, was it 3 weeks? I mean, 4 years is a long time. So it's very hard for me to predict where the world is going. So I think right now I'm going to work on academic articles and make that sort of build a conversation with these blogs. But there are certain big trends that I think it's important for us to think about. One is that we are certainly seeing a sort of rethinking of the role of the state and the market. So I don't think we are going back to the neoliberal world and those institutions, the WTOs of the world. So I like to do some work in envisioning that post-neoliberal world. We are seeing the state back in, we're seeing more industrial policy. If you see part of that AI race, the states investing much more through subsidies and this kind of economic nationalism. So in many ways, I think we see a different future, and to try to help us understand what that future will look like is something that I'm certainly very, very interested in. So I'm reading a lot on industrial policy. I'm reading a lot on sort of rethinking the state and the markets, the role of companies. But it's very confusing if you look at, you don't even know whether it's Elon Musk or President Trump who is running the United States at this point. So we see the companies penetrating in many ways the public sphere with their outsized influence, but then we see the state really asserting itself in the marketplace. So I'm interested in those dynamics, and we'll see whether that will be a book. But I just think it is such a fascinating time for a scholar. It's a troubling time, but my goal as a scholar is to sort of provide more of an analytical framework to try to make sense of this fast-moving world.
Amazing, and I'm looking forward to sitting again with you when your new book about this state and corporate power intertwined book. It looks like it will be something like that. So I hope to sit again and we can have another talk like this. Thank you so much, and it was such an enlightening conversation. I think the audience is also super happy. I was reading the comments now; they're really enjoying our conversation. So thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
This was great, Louise. My great pleasure. It was really great to be in a conversation, and thanks for all the wonderful work that you're doing and the entire community you have built. So it was great to be part of the conversation today. My
pleasure. Thank you, everyone in the audience. You're always so friendly and nice and involved, so it's a pleasure to be here. Two reminders, so don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter to stay up to date with everything AI governance, and to be informed, be notified about the upcoming live talk. So louisasnewsletter.com. If you want to join the AI governance training in March, so there are still seats available, so register. So thank you, everyone, and see you next month in the next live talk. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.